Good morning, everyone, and to our attendees in the Zoom room and to those of us joining via YouTube live stream. Good morning and welcome to the virtual third International Conference on Cordillera Studies. This is panel 20, The Economics and Politics of Water. My name is Karin Codjase Bangsoy. I teach political science here at the University of the Philippines, Baguio, and I will be your moderator for this panel. With me as assistant moderator is Sir Jeffrey Javier of the Cordillera Studies Center, UP Baguio. So we have three presenters for this panel who will lead us in our discussion on the socio-economic and political dimensions of water provision here in Baguio City. Our panel this afternoon will proceed as follows. We will have the presentations of all panelists, followed by the time allotted to the audience for questions and open discussion. May we remind our participants to send their questions through the chat feature. They can be sent at any time during the presentations, but they will only be discussed during the open forum. If you want to, you may also use the raise hand function to ask your questions directly to the panelists later. So kindly keep those reminders in mind as we conduct this session. So our first speaker is Prof. Gladys Cruz. She is an associate professor of economics at the College of Social Sciences of UP Baguio. She has done research on issues related to urbanization, education, migration, and competitiveness. The presentation of Prof. Cruz is entitled Characterizing Demand for Residential Water in Baguio City.
Good morning. My paper is entitled Characterizing Residential Water Demand in Baguio City. It aims to understand the water situation in Baguio by describing the patterns in water demand and identify its economic determinants. Baguio City is a major secondary city outside of the National Capital Region. As the only highly urbanized area in the Cordillera, it is the center of economic activity in the region. It serves as a commercial hub, educational center, and major tourist destination. In-migration has fueled rapid population growth, making it the most densely populated area in the region. Accompanying the growth of commercial activities is the expansion of residential land use systems, even into the city's severely limited watersheds and forest reservations. Water shortage has been a perennial problem in the city, and climate change has exacerbated it. The data used in this paper were derived from 2 rounds of household surveys conducted by the Water Security Project Phase 1 and Phase 2 of UP Baguio. The first was conducted in 2015. Its target population was Baguio households in general, and its sample size was 500. Multi-stage cluster sampling was employed to select a random sample from 19 barangays. The second survey was conducted in 2016, and it was focused on poor households only, with a sample size of 300 derived from among the 4 Ps beneficiaries in the city. The 2016 survey thus yielded a more homogeneous sample than that derived in 2015 in order to highlight the water situation faced by the poor and their access to water during the rainy season. Using the DSWD list of 4 Ps beneficiaries, we identified the barangays with the most number of grantees, and then we picked a random sample of respondents from the top 9 barangays using simple random sampling. The share of each barangay to the total sample depends on its percentage share in the narrowed down 4 Ps list covering the top 9 barangays only. Let us briefly discuss the key findings on water demand. Amidst a context of water scarcity, Baguio households cope by deriving their water needs from a combination of sources at quantities and prices they can afford. Water scarcity is a fact of life in Baguio City. The proof of this is the presence of water storage devices in the homes of all local residents who rarely rely on one source only to provide for their water needs. Instead, They choose an optimal mix of water sources to get the amount they need at the price they can afford. Households in the city derive water from a variety of sources including the Baguio Water District, commercial providers of water delivery services, water refilling stations which provide purified drinking water, private deep wells, community water systems, and of course, rainwater. Water from these sources differ in price, ease of access or convenience, and water quality. Users choose that combination that will provide them what they need at the price they can afford. The Baguio Water District, being the local water utility, is the main supplier of water in the city since its establishment in 1975. Water from the Bawadi is distributed on a rotational basis following a given schedule. Concessionaires rarely have water supply from the city 24 hours, 7 days a week, as the norm is to have 2 to 3 times a week schedule. Hence, it is the practice among local residents to own drums and water tanks to store water to sustain their water needs on the days when they do not receive water from the Bawadi. Having said this, it bears noting that not all households are connected to the Bawadi, either for reasons like there is no service in their area or by user's choice. Our survey findings shown on this slide in 2015 show that only 2/3 of households in the general population of the city own a private Bawadi line. But low as this seems, the figure is still 2.48 times higher than the 27.7% proportion of poor households who enjoy the same, as found in our 2016 household survey. The implication of these statistics is that there is a substantial proportion of households, poor or otherwise, without a Bawadi connection, with poor households outnumbering the average Baguio household by 1.58 times. This certainly raises equity concerns since the poor seem to be underserved by the local water utility. Baguio residents address domestic water needs through informal social arrangements among a network of households that live close together. Survey results show that 37.3% of households with private Bawadi lines regularly share their water with neighbors or relatives who do not have Bawadi connections. Buying Bawadi water from a neighbor is also prevalent, as 1 in 4 poor households do this. This is significantly higher than the 1 in 10 ratio found for the general population of Baguio households in the 2015 survey. Poor households were found to be 11 times more likely to engage in such a practice compared to the typical household in the general population. The question that can be raised is thus, are those without a Bawadi connection interested in acquiring one? If so, what is stopping them from doing so? Survey data show that there is great interest, especially among the poor, to have a private Bawadi line, as seen in the blue bar derived in the 2016 survey. 77.1% of those without a Bawadi line among our poor respondents said that they would like to be connected to Bawadi. This is significantly higher than the 46.5% of households expressing the same interest in the 2015 household survey. For the poor, having a Bawadi line will mean a substantial allocation from the household's meager budget. Nonetheless, they are optimistic that their water needs can be better addressed if they have their own Bawadi connection. Respondents, however, expressed concern about how expensive it is to apply for one's own line. This was estimated at 8,000 pesos in 2015. Similarly, respondents also say that they do not like it that Bawadi charges a flat rate for consumption of 10 cubic meters or less. There are also legal constraints that prevent households from getting a Bawadi connection. In particular, informal settlers are not qualified to apply for their own lines because of land tenure issues. Thus, even if the barangay is served by the Bawadi, not all households there can be connected to the water system. Hence, the reliance on informal arrangements with neighbors or relatives with a Bawadi connection. Topographic constraints also limit access to Bawadi services. Bawadi pipelines have not been built in the city's mountainous areas. Since many poor households live in geographically precarious and inaccessible places, they are doubly difficult to reach by the Bawadi water supply system. Not getting a Bawadi line could also be a matter of personal choice. Some households are willing to invest on a private deep well, assuming that a water source is available nearby. Some also prefer to get their water from the spring or creek near their residence, or manage their own water supply by ordering from a water delivery service, only when they need to do so. This table demonstrates that Bawadi service is thus augmented by water derived from other sources like water delivery, purified drinking water sourced from water refilling stations, spring water that either comes from undeveloped natural sources or from community water systems created to cater to the water needs of a limited number of water cooperative or water association members. There are also private deep wells in the city owned and developed by individuals to provide for their own needs. Delivered water in tankers with capacities of 10 or 20 drums is commercially available in the city and is being used by about 1/3 of households. But because water delivery requires a cash outlay, a smaller proportion of poor households with Bawadi service depend on it. 15.7% versus 22.2% in the general population. A drum of water costs 28 pesos on the average when delivered, although it is sold for as low as 15 pesos or as high as 50 pesos, depending on how far and how accessible the destination is. Bawadi also maintains its own water delivery service. Natural sources of water also abound in the city, but obviously they are not uniformly located geographically. Note that poor households are 1.45 times more likely to use springs and creeks for their water needs than the typical household found in the 2015 sample. This implies that economic status matters on whether a household will use undeveloped water sources for their needs, even if they are not always accessible nor close to one's place of residence. 2 community water systems were also found in the survey sites. One is a water cooperative while the other is a water association. Spring water has been developed by these organizations for distribution to a limited network of users at a price. Private deep wells also abound in the city. Only a small proportion of households in the survey claim to own one or have access to one. Permits to develop such are granted by the local Water Utilities Administration in Manila, often without the knowledge of the local utility. In most cases, private deep wells provide the water needs only of the owners, although we observed a few households who purchase water from a neighbor with a deep well on a regular basis. Rainwater harvesting is also a prevalent practice in Baguio City, even among those with Bawadi connection. Although the proportion is almost double for the poor at 80.7% compared to only 44.3% among typical Baguio households. Water refilling stations are also a major source of drinking water, supplying the needs of over 91% of households in both rounds of household surveys. These are accessible to the public either through delivery service or pick-up and are commonly available for sale in sari-sari stores in the community. For most households, purified water has taken the place of the boiling of drinking water, a practice that Baguio households are known for years. A 5-gallon bottle of purified water typically retails at 27 pesos on average. In 2015, we found that majority of Bawadi concessionaires perceive water adequacy to be adequate and more than adequate. This means that there seems to be no perception of water inadequacy. This perception may be partly due to the ready availability of drinking water from water refilling stations and bottled water from supermarkets. Water for other domestic uses may also not appear to be inadequate because households can access water through water delivery services and water from one's neighbor. In addition, community water systems provide water in Baguio barangays where the Bawadi is absent. Further, private water systems act as an alternative for households without Bawadi connection or as a complementary source of water to households with a Bawadi connection. Households without a Bawadi connection also combine water from different sources, with purified water and rainwater serving as the most common. Most poor households use spring water compared to only 15.7% in the general population of households. A surprising result found in this slide is that poor households have a 2.5 times higher probability of using delivered water than the typical households in the city, 39.6% versus 15.7% in the general population. Let's now go to the second key finding on water demand. Water from different sources vary in price, ease of access or convenience, and quality. The fact that rainwater is free and plentiful during the rainy season and requires very simple technology to harvest explains why 91% of households with or without a Bawadi connection practice rainwater harvesting. Given that its quality is uncertain, its use for household activities is generally limited to doing the laundry, cleaning around the house, flushing the toilet, and watering plants. For poor households, the onset of the rainy season is a blessing as their expenditures for Bawadi water, bought from neighbors, and delivered water can be saved for other household needs. The problem, however, is that water harvesting is done small scale, as cisterns are rare, so the amount of water collected is insufficient to support the household's needs. Spring water is also generally free when household members do the collecting and hauling themselves. Since this task is often assigned to adult male and female household members, time and effort expended in water collection could have been spent in more productive activities. Water quality is also uncertain and prone to pollution when activities like washing clothes and bathing are done close to the water source. Because springs and creeks are also open access, there are no rules regarding extraction and pollution. Spring water also becomes murky during the rainy season, indicating that households have to look for their water elsewhere during these times. Bawadi water is theoretically the most convenient to use if it is available on demand and flowing freely in one's faucet. As pointed out earlier, water is not available 24/7, and if water is collected in drums rather than tanks, this will require that they be manually fetched for household use. The relative price of bawadi water will be discussed later. Delivered water stored in tanks could be as convenient as bawadi water for the same reason, but it requires some waiting time from when the order is placed to when the water is delivered. Issues with regards quantity arise as leakage happens when water is transported and conveyed to the households. It also requires that households have the storage to meet the minimum order. Regulations to ensure water quality are required and must be enforced. What about water from a deep well? Establishing deep wells is costly, and not everyone is fortunate to have a water source to tap for this purpose. Households who use this source consider that water is abundant and clean, although some observe a decrease over time in the amount that they are able to get from the private deep wells. They are also easy to use once established. The community water systems we found in our survey sites were established because bawadi service is not available there. With financial assistance from an NGO and the technical advice of bawadi, cooperative members in the area are now able to enjoy piped water to their homes from the communal water tanks established by the cooperative. This makes this water source accessible and convenient relative to the manual fetching of water from the spring or creek. Water quality is ensured with regular laboratory tests to ensure potability. Purified drinking water is available anywhere, even in sari-sari stores, making it very convenient and more convenient than boiling bawadi or delivered water. Using a combination of water sources is thus a typical strategy adopted by Baguio residents to meet. Let us now examine the relative prices of water from the different sources. The data uses per cubic meter as unit of measurement, even if transactions are done on a per drum basis, as is the case with water delivery and water bought from one's neighbors. Statistics show that water prices are generally not competitive. Excluding deep well water, which is bought and sold by a very limited number of households residing in one sitio, bawadi water is the cheapest at 38 pesos per cubic meter using the minimum rate for residential A users. The same conclusion is derived even when the average block price for 21 to 30 cubic meters is used, which is 46 pesos and 20 centavos per cubic meter. Note that water from the community water system costs 75 pesos, which is double the bawadi minimum rate. Water bought from one's neighbor costs 29 pesos per drum or 145 pesos per cubic meter, although the cheapest is 50 pesos per cubic meter, while the highest price is 250 pesos. The cost of water may be considered exorbitant when compared to the bawadi rate of 38 pesos per cubic meter or 7 pesos and 60 centavos per drum. But it is competitive when compared to the price charged by water delivery services, which averages at 28 pesos per drum or 140 pesos per cubic meter. Households thus choose water from the source that they can afford. Key finding number 3 looks at the sources of water during the dry and rainy season. Statistics show that for primary uses of water, like cooking, washing dishes, and bathing, households generally use the same water source during the dry and rainy seasons, as indicated by the straw very strong correlation between the main water source used by the household during the dry and rainy season. The crosstab relating water sources for the dry and rainy seasons for cooking, washing dishes, and bathing show a 75% to 100% correspondence between the water source used. Minimal shifts in water sources were observed for washing dishes, with 33% of those who used delivered water during the dry season shifting to rainwater use. 23% of those who used spring water also shifted to rainwater. For bathing, 23% of those who get water from springs shifted to rainwater when it is available. In general, the same water source is used during the dry and rainy season for purposes that require that the best quality water be used. For secondary uses of water like doing the laundry, flushing the toilet, and cleaning jobs, a significant proportion of households use the cheaper water source, i.e., rain, to save on the cost of water derived from their regular but expensive source. Hence, there is a substitution effect during the rainy season, as indicated by the moderate correlation between the major source of water for the dry and rainy season shown in the table. For laundry, at least 1/3 of those who use bawadi water, half of those who use delivered water, 1/3 of those who use spring water shifted to rainwater for secondary uses, in particular doing their laundry. Flushing toilets also shifted from using bawadi water to rain, 55%, 75% from water delivery to rainwater, and 39% from spring to rainwater. Even those who use deep well water shift to rainwater to flush their toilets. Let us now go to the determinants of water demand. Baguio households choose an optimal bundle of water derived from various sources to meet their water needs, subject to their income, the relative prices of water from different sources, the ease and convenience of access, and the availability of free substitutes. I used a simple double log regression model to estimate the demand function for bawadi water, as it is determined by its own price, household income, and household size. I also introduced dummy variables to represent the other water sources, 1 if using that water source, and 0 if not using. Results indicate that bawadi water is price inelastic, consistent with related literature. When price is increased by 1%, it will lead to a decrease in the quantity demanded of water, but only by 0.53%. This implies that price cannot be used as a policy tool to induce households to conserve water. Of course, the approach used here does not consider how bawadi water is actually priced, which is block pricing. Rather, average price was used in the regression model. The price variable is significant at the 1% level of alpha. The regression model also calculates that bawadi water is income inelastic, where an increase in income leads to a proportionately smaller increase in water consumption. Households in Baguio do not have the luxury of having lawns to water, nor swimming pools to maintain, goods that are associated with the wealthy. The positive coefficient for household income implies that water is a normal good. Income is significant at the 10% level of alpha. The positive sign of the household size variable is as expected. Larger households tend to consume more water than smaller households. With regards to dummy variables representing use of alternative water sources to bawadi, only delivered water was found to be significant, but its sign is contrary to expectations. A second regression model was derived, this time to explain the demand for delivered water. The signs of all coefficients are as expected, but only household income and access to natural sources of water were found to be significant. The demand for delivered water is inelastic, just like bawadi water, with respect to income and its own price. In conclusion, relative cost, ease of access, and the quality of water are the factors that Baguio residents consider in their choice of water source to use for their various domestic activities. This paper examined the complementarity of water during the dry season and rainy season, and its substitutability during the rainy season. Water demand was found to be price inelastic, suggesting that water pricing policy might not be conducive for water conservation. Poor households in Baguio City address their water security needs by deriving water from a combination of sources, each chosen for their relative cost, ease of access, and quality. Faced with financial constraints, poor households tend to rely on free sources of water like springs, creeks, and rainwater when these are available, even when water quality is uncertain. The poorest of the poor, who cannot afford to tap his own water pipe in the spring that is 1 kilometer or so away from his residence, will have to invest labor time to fetch water for cooking, bathing, etc. Equity issues lie at the heart of ensuring water security for the poor. Tourism and education are a major component of the Baguio economy. Their significant share in water demand is as yet unaccounted for. Tourist activities have been curtailed by the pandemic and classes have gone remote. Has the water situation changed for local residents as a result? The pandemic offers data for scientific study without the need for experimentation. This deserves to be examined as it relates to Baguio's carrying capacity and the best way for the city to bounce forward in the near future. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Prof. Gladys, for that overview on the characteristics of economic demand for water in Baguio, particularly in the residential household context. Our next speaker is Prof. Lorelei Mendoza. She is Professor of Economics at the College of Social Sciences of UP Baguio. She obtained a doctorate in economics from the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium in 1997. She has conducted research on livelihoods of farming households in Cordillera communities, gender and household economics, local governance, and local resource management practices. After 45 years of service, she retired last June of 2021. Prof. Mendoza's presentation is entitled Towards Affordability and Equity, Price and Non-Price Aspects of Water Use by the Poor.
Good morning and welcome to the third day of the third International Conference on Cordillera Studies. I am very pleased to join Professor Alejandro Ciencia and Professor Gladys Cruz in this panel on the theme, The Economics and Politics of Water. The paper is entitled Towards Affordability and Equity, Price and Non-Price Aspects of Water Use by the Poor. My presentation demonstrates why water adequacy is more importantly assessed at a micro or household or consumer unit level, and it describes how poor households are enabled, constrained, or excluded by operational features of the local water utility firm. My focus on poor households and how they obtain access and use water is inspired by findings from related studies. Let me cite two of these. Study 1 by Tuyat Han for Vietnam showed that all wealth groups' access to improved water sources increased from 2000 to 2011. However, the proportional increases among the groups were unequal. It concluded that the level of inequality in access to improved water sources increased over time. Study 2 by Guppy for rural Cambodia and Vietnam showed that despite similarities in the household's access to water supply and the quantity of water resources, poor and non-poor households reported differences in water use, with poor households on average using 44.5 liters daily per person, or one half the total liters daily per person from non-poor households at 91.6. From the viewpoint of the household, its water access and use in Baguio City is shaped by a water service system. Such a system consists of the local water district with its formal procedures that define how water supply reaches its clients, the presence of commercial providers of bottled water, water delivery services, and water refilling stations. There are also non-market or natural water sources like rainfall, springs, and creeks. And 4, the household's capacity for water shortage. Table 1 compares the 2015 survey of a sample of 500 households with the 2016 survey of 300 poor households on the question of who has a Bawadi connection. The access to piped and treated water is primarily made available in the city by the Baguio Water District, locally referred to as Bawadi. The fourth column tells us that 71% of all households have a Bawadi connection, and only 54% of poor households do. The phenomenon of sharing of a Bawadi connection surfaced in both household surveys. The last column of the table shows that this is true for 32% of all households, and it is also true for almost twice at 68% of poor households. It seems reasonable to think that the high proportion among poor households sharing a connection can be partly explained by the high cost of installing it. So we checked the cost of a Bawadi connection. The total amount of 6,400 for not more than 6 meters for a dirt road, as stated in the company's information material for Bawadi applicants, is broken down as follows: the cost of the water meter, the cost of materials, installation costs, a contract fee, and an inspection fee. How large is 6,400? Almost as much as the monthly food threshold of 6,329 for a family of 5 in 2015, as much as 71% of the monthly poverty threshold of 9,064 for a family of 5, also in 2015, as much as 7 times for the lowest income quintile. Therefore, the cost of a Bawadi connection is a major expenditure that a poor household can ill afford, and why sharing a Bawadi connection is so prevalent among poor households in Baguio. When the cost to obtain a Bawadi connection is hurdled, the household must now confront the affordability of a monthly water bill. So let's discuss the monthly water bill. Bawadi charges 370 pesos for residential A and 508 pesos and 70 centavos for residential C for consumption of 10 cubic meters and less. Group A is defined as one family in one house or condominium apartment units with individual water meters or individual metered units with a main meter or vacation houses. Group C refers to a single house in a subdivision. At 10 cubic meters, the price per liter for the first block is 37 per cubic meter for Group A and 50 pesos and 70 centavos per cubic meter for Group C. Table 4 shows the increasing block tariff that Bawadi charges, and it shows a higher price per cubic meter when consumption increases to a value between 10 and 20 cubic meters, and higher still for consumption between 21 and 30 cubic meters, and so on, for both groups A and C. The fourth and last columns of Table 4 show the percentage increase of the tariff per cubic meter for the higher consumption block relative to Block 1. At Block 5, the cost of 1 cubic meter of water is 59% more than the base price for Block 1. This is true for both residential groups A and C. We can conclude from Table 4 that households that consume 10 cubic meters pay less per cubic meter than those who consume more than 10 cubic meters. But can we also conclude that the increasing block tariff scheme followed by Bawadi benefits the poor household? Not necessarily. Consuming less water may be due to the size of the household. Water consumption is lower for small families and higher for large families. So the conclusion from Table 4 is that the increasing block tariff benefits small households who may not be poor. Let us now turn our attention to the effect of the fixed amount that Bawadi charges a household that consumes 10 cubic meters or less. For residential A, this fixed charge is 370 pesos a month. Now, what will a cubic meter of water cost when a household consumes less than 10 cubic meters, like 5 to 9 cubic meters? They still have to pay the fixed charge of 370 pesos. So, Table 5 shows us the answer. We observe that the price per cubic meter is higher for lesser water consumed. At 5 cubic meters, the price per cubic meter is 74 pesos. But at 9 cubic meters, the price per cubic meter is 41 pesos. A household that consumes 5 cubic meter is paying twice the price per cubic meter at 74 compared to a household that consumes 10 cubic meters at the price of 37 pesos. The outcome of the fixed charge may be the incentive for a household with a Bawadi connection and who does not consume 10 cubic meters in a month to share the water that comes to its tap with another household. If the Bawadi connected household can ensure that only 10 cubic meter is its total consumption per month, sharing it with another means sharing the cost of its monthly bill for its benefits. Having access to piped water is meant to enable the consumption of water at levels considered adequate. According to GAPI, the minimum recommended water use of 50 liters per capita per day is the common measure used in water research. In this regard, it is interesting to report on the results of a small experiment on the pattern of daily water use per capita from water diaries of 12 persons who participated in this aspect of the 2015 research study. 5 persons had a non-Bawadi source, such as unprotected springs and water delivery trucks, as their major water source. The 7 other persons had as their major water source a shared Bawadi connection. The average daily water use for persons with non-Bawadi sources was 61 liters, while the average daily water use for persons with a shared Bawadi connection was 77 liters. The former consumed only 80% of the volume consumed by the latter. From this small experiment, it appears that having access to a Bawadi connection, even if done through a shared line, contributes to a higher successful consumption of the recommended minimum daily amount of water. What are some changes that Bawadi can do for the poor household? I have 2 recommendations, one on the fixed charge and the second on the cost of a Bawadi connection. Can Bawadi consider reducing the fixed charge? What would be this lower fixed charge? And this is my reply. Let's assume a 5-member household who must consume 50 liters per capita daily, which is the minimum basic water requirement. This will total 1.5 cubic meter per person in a month and 7.5 cubic meters for this 5-member household. If we allow a lower total of 7 cubic meters instead of 7.5 cubic meters per month and continue to charge the price of each cubic meter at 37 pesos, the total becomes 260 pesos. Therefore, can Bawadi consider establishing a lower block of 0 to 7 cubic meters and decrease the monthly fixed charge to 260 pesos? The current minimum block can be retained at 8 to 10 cubic meters with a fixed charge of 370 pesos per month. What about subsidizing the cost of a water connection for a poor household? It was shown that the cost of a Bawadi connection is a very large expenditure that a poor household can ill afford. It appears wise, in the interest of equitable access to water, that we consider subsidizing the cost of installing a water connection for a poor household or even a shared connection for 2 or more poor households. However, the responsibility and the subsidy to assist poor customers should belong to the government and not the local water utility. If providing potable water services to poor households is considered a proper objective of Bawadi as a public corporation responsible for the provision of potable water in its service area, it can design a program that subsidizes a Bawadi water connection for poor households using funds provided by the city government as part of its poverty alleviation program. The identification of the poor household can be undertaken through the Department of Social Welfare and Development's 4Ps program. In summary, may I ask you to recall the elements of the water service system that a household relies upon. We have shown how the local water utility firm can do much by focusing on how it can serve the poor household better through the setting of a lower fixed charge and enabling a partial or total subsidy for a water connection. It is obvious that the poor household's access to commercial providers for water services and water delivery is difficult due to income inadequacy. Access to natural water sources, like the presence of a spring or creek close to one's residence in the city, is more a matter of geographical luck. Now, rainfall in Baguio is more evenly distributed among the households, but keeping rainwater in storage requires the expenditure on pails, drums, and tanks. Again, this capacity is dependent on the income of households, and the poor will be less able to acquire storage capacity compared to the better off. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Prof. Lorelei Mendoza, for that discussion on water services and poor households in Baguio City. A reminder to our participants that you can send in your questions at any time as the presentations are ongoing. Our third and last speaker is Prof. Alejandro Ciencia Jr. He is Associate Professor of Political Science at the College of Social Sciences, UP Baguio. He obtained his PhD in Political Science from UP Diliman in 2010. His research interests include judicial politics and behavior, justice and dispute settlement, indigenous peoples' rights and multiculturalism, water security, and urban resilience. Prof. Ciencia's presentation is entitled Water Security in the Context of the Global Climate Emergency.
Water Security in the Context of the Global Climate Emergency is the title of a chapter that I co-wrote with Professors Lorelei Mendoza, Gladys Cruz, Mai Peñalba, and Rainier de la Cruz for a book to be published by the UP Resilience Institute. In this presentation, I will discuss some ideas that were expressed in that book chapter. It is my intention, however, to highlight the politics of water, or to be more precise, the politics of water security, an idea that was not adequately discussed in the chapter. In fact, the term politics of water was not mentioned at all. The primary objective of this presentation is to draw attention to the debate between proponents of water as a human right and water as a precious resource. How people will resolve this debate will have a bearing on whether they will be water secure in the future. Now, what does the phrase politics of water mean? To make sense of the term, we obviously need to clarify what we mean by politics. Politics has been defined or described in a variety of ways. Harold Glaswell defined politics as who gets what, when, how. Note that Glaswell drew attention to the idea that politics is actually about the distribution of resources in society that are often scarce. As such, access and actual enjoyment of said resources are oftentimes limited to only a few individuals. Power, prestige, wealth, and any resource that is essential for human survival are examples of these scarce resources. David Easton, meanwhile, defined politics as the authoritative allocation of scarce values. Note that Easton seems to agree with Laswell that politics is about a scarce value or resource and its allocation or distribution. But Easton adds that politics involves the authoritative allocation of scarce values. Among political science scholars, this is just a fancy phrase for the making of decisions that are binding on the public. Note too that authoritative allocation also means the exercise of legitimate power to allocate scarce values. For some Sarkisian, politics is conflict over values. When we reflect on our political or ideological differences, our reflection will often lead us to the conclusion that our differences are mostly about values, human rights and civil liberties versus peace and order, equality versus order, diversity versus unity, personal liberty versus public safety. The reality of disagreement over values underscores the point that addressing problems in society often entails trade-offs or compromises. Oftentimes, policymakers and enforcers uphold one social value, like peace and order, at the expense of another, like human rights. In any case, we must also note that Sarkisian also understood politics as the resolution of conflict, which leads us back to David Easton. In this presentation, I intend to highlight the allocation and conflict dimensions of the politics of water. Water as a scarce resource. Water seems to be an appropriate subject matter for politics. The politics of water makes perfect sense because water, particularly potable water, is a scarce resource. There are claims that without water, a person would typically last only 3 to 4 days, although a person can go without food for about 3 weeks. Water is vital to human survival. To survive, humans must have access to fresh water. Note, however, that only 2.5% of the Earth's water is fresh. Moreover, only 1% of the planet's water is usable and easily accessible for human survival. Potable water can be the object of conflict. Issues of access to water and its utilization can result in violent conflict. Accordingly, such conflicts demand resolution and the exercise of power or authority. In this paper, I argue that the politics of water deserves serious attention. Water security. In July 2010, the United Nations, through its General Assembly, adopted a resolution to officially recognize the right to safe and clean drinking water and sanitation as a human right. By doing so, the UN explicitly made it the duty of states to provide its citizens with potable water. But if one examines the resolution and other pertinent UN documents, one finds that in addition to providing water that is safe and clean, states are also obligated to ensure that the water they provide is sufficient, accessible, and affordable. For the UN, the human right to water and sanitation is to be understood as the right to be water secure. The UN defines water security as the capacity of a population to safeguard sustainable access to adequate quantities of acceptable quality water for sustaining livelihoods, human well-being, and socioeconomic development, for ensuring protection against waterborne pollution and water-related disasters, and for preserving ecosystems in a climate of peace and political stability. Dimensions of water security. The foregoing suggests that water security as a human right has many dimensions. First, there is a dimension of quantity. People ought to have access to adequate quantities of water. Second, there is a dimension of quality. People ought to have access to safe and clean drinking water. The issue of access may be subjected to further problematization. We can think of access to water in relation to physical accessibility, particularly having access to a water source within one's community or area of residence. We can also think of access in terms of financial accessibility or affordability. Some scholars also talked about the dimension of seasonality. The quantity and quality of water available to residents of a place tend to vary from season to season. Hence, people may feel water secure at particular times of the year, but not all year long. The dimensions of water can inform our appreciation of the policy issues that are intimately linked to it. The global climate emergency. In November 2019, more than 11,000 scientists from different countries signed a declaration proclaiming that the planet clearly faces a climate emergency. The declaration is essentially a call for greater urgency, more commitment, and better coordinated global actions against climate change. As to the link between the climate emergency and water insecurity, climate change is expected to produce fluctuations in water supply. In addition to changes in the quality of available water, and in the times of the year when water is most abundant. Accordingly, such factors will bear on the accessibility and affordability of water, and on the water utilization behaviors of people. Interestingly, the water utilization behaviors of humans can in turn either exacerbate or mitigate the climate emergency. Water stress. The Earth's population is projected to reach 9.7 billion by 2050. In the coming years, the demand for fresh water will significantly increase with the projected growth in the world's population and outpace the supply of fresh water that is available to humans. If recent developments in a number of cities around the world are any indication of the general condition of life in the future, life in the cities of tomorrow does not appear enticing. Big cities in different parts of the world are predicted to experience water stress within the next 20 years. The cities include Sao Paulo, Bangalore, Beijing, Cairo, Jakarta, Moscow, Istanbul, Mexico City, London, Tokyo, and Miami, in addition to Cape Town, whose experience with water stress was widely reported in the West in 2018. Water stress occurs when the demand for water in cities exceeds the available amount during a certain period or when poor quality restricts its use. Now, we really don't need to look far to find other examples of cities that are experiencing water stress. In March 2019, many Metro Manila residents were shocked to find that their water faucets had suddenly run dry. A water supply crisis had hit the cities of Metro Manila. Baguio is also another obvious example where water shortages are experienced by residents on a regular basis. The politics of water in Baguio City will be discussed shortly, but at this point, let me propose that an inquiry into the politics of water in an urban setting ought to be mindful of the climate emergency and the possibility of water stress. Politics of water in Baguio City: who gets Bawadi water, when, how? In this section, we will review briefly some of the findings of our studies on water security in Baguio City. But before we discuss these findings, it is important that we recognize the important role of the Baguio Water District, or Bawadi, in providing water to Baguio's residents. The Bawadi is a government-owned and controlled corporation whose primary mission or mandate is to provide adequate and potable water at affordable rates to all customers. Note here that the Bawadi's mission statement appears to have been informed by the concept of water security. Below is a rather cursory description of the politics of water security in Baguio City. Who gets Bawadi water, when, and how? Our 2015 survey data show that only 68.6% of households in the city have a private connection to the Bawadi. This means that around 30%, or almost one-third, of households in the city get their water from non-Bawadi sources. The Baguio Water District follows a water distribution schedule. Constant and continuous water supply from the Bawadi is a rare occurrence in Baguio City and is reported by only 10% of Bawadi households. Less than 40% of Bawadi users get water daily, but it does not last the whole day. A 2 to 3 times a week water schedule appears to be the norm, with 21.3% and 35.3% reporting such respectively. Who gets adequate amounts of water from the Bawadi? 37% of consumers say that Bawadi water is more than adequate, while only 4.4% say that Bawadi water is inadequate or very inadequate. 58% say Bawadi water is either adequate or just enough to meet household needs. Who gets clean and safe water from the Bawadi? Survey data show that Bawadi consumers generally perceive the water they receive to be clean, since it has no smell, 67.3%, and no color, 64.7%. Interestingly, however, there is a general perception then and now that tap water from Bawadi is not safe for drinking unless boiled first. In fact, the drinking water of Baguio residents is supplied mainly by water refilling stations, which purify or filter water for consumption. 85% of all households consider this to be their main source of drinking water. The actual behavior of Baguio residents indicates that potable water is supplied not by the Bawadi, but by private water refilling stations. Note that 2013 tests provided the preliminary finding that the Bawadi water quality in 2013 was poorer than that of water bought at water refilling stations. Who gets affordable water from the Bawadi? 50.1% of consumers considered the cost of Bawadi water to be within their means. 8% of Bawadi consumers claimed that it is not affordable. Okay, so our 2015 study thus provided some rather intriguing and nuanced findings. To reiterate, it revealed the following. Only a small percentage of Bawadi consumers say their water is inadequate or very inadequate. Still, the 2015 survey also showed that around 30% of Baguio residents do not have a private Bawadi connection. Almost two-thirds of consumers say they perceive Bawadi water to be clean. Yet, intriguingly, 85% of Baguio residents rely on water refilling stations and not the Bawadi for their drinking water. 8% of consumers say Bawadi water is not affordable. If water security is indeed the right of citizens and ensuring water security is the duty of states, one can argue thus far that the Bawadi, as a government-owned and controlled corporation, has not satisfactorily fulfilled this duty. Again, ensuring water security is the duty of states, and it is not simply about providing adequate quantities of water. It is also about providing safe, clean, and affordable water for all. Quite interestingly, a second look at the Bawadi's mission statement would reveal that its mandate is actually to provide adequate and potable water at affordable rates to all of its customers, not to all residents of Baguio. This suggests that while the Bawadi is government-owned and controlled, it operates like a firm with customers. One can surmise that financial considerations must have affected Bawadi's performance of its mandate. If so, this scenario leads us to consider the trade-offs or compromises that ensuring water security often entails. The politics of water, conflict over values. A rapidly growing population with the attendant rise in water demand, dwindling water supply, and poverty incidence provide the backdrop for politics of water in different parts of the globe. A review of materials on water security would reveal a debate between those who see water as a precious resource and those who regard water as a human right. Stated differently, the debate or conflict is about prioritizing the protection of water or its equitable use by humans. A core issue of the debate is whether water ought to be expensive or cheap. Proponents of equitability would prefer putting a low price tag on water, or if at all, no price tag on it. Attaching a price tag on water would prevent poor individuals and households from having access to clean and safe drinking water. This position thus pays special attention to the needs of the poor and appears consistent with the assertion that water is a human right. If access to water is indeed a human right, then it ought to be accessible to all humans, whether rich or poor. The rival position is critical of this pro-poor water is a human right point of view. Proponents of the rival position worry that promulgating the idea that water is a human right and the accompanying suggestion that water ought to be free will only lead people to use water irresponsibly and not give it the value it actually possesses as a precious and unsubstitutable resource. We can label this as the water is a precious resource position. Consistent with this idea is the argument that putting a high price tag on water would enable water districts like the Bawadi to collect considerable profits for maintaining piped water systems, sewerage systems, and wastewater management facilities. Upholding water's value and putting a high price tag on it would improve the delivery of services. This position clearly has compelling arguments, but we also see problems with it. As things stand, many poor people already lack financial access to water. Setting a higher price for water would only aggravate the poor's lack of access to water. Many poor people would be priced out of the experience of accessing water. Moreover, putting a high price on water encourages the management of water purely for financial gain. This will only make the poor and society in general more vulnerable to the profit-seeking motives of business interests and exacerbate existing economic inequalities in society. There are also compelling reasons to acknowledge water as a human right. Foremost among this is the undeniable fact that water is essential to human survival. To deprive people of water is to deny them of the right to live. Treating access to water as a human right seems consistent with the idea of treating people equitably and acknowledging that they have the right to live as people. Resolving the conflict. On a conceptual level, providing potable water as a basic need and human right is consistent with the idea of equitability. And the reason why water ought to be provided to all people is because water is indeed a precious and invaluable life-sustaining resource. The core idea of water as a precious resource is not denied by proponents of water as a human right. It is precisely because it is precious and essential to life that it ought to be declared a human right. And we can thus endorse the view that people have a right to clean and safe water, and at the same time argue that people have an obligation to value water and to protect the integrity of water resources. That irresponsible users of water ought to be penalized, and that responsible users of water and custodians of water's resources ought to be rewarded. Our recommendation is to reconcile the two seemingly rival positions to find a balance. The water is a human right versus water is a precious resource is a false dichotomy because water can be viewed as both. The real challenge for people then, for policymakers and water providers, is to find how to concretize a realistic and workable reconciliation of the two positions. How do we ensure access to adequate, safe, and clean water as a means to secure human survival without undervaluing water as a resource? I believe this question will be at the core of the debate about water utilization in the coming years. In summary, this paper argues that in very general terms, the politics of water at present and in the future will be informed by the efforts to reconcile seemingly rival positions on water. To be successful, efforts to achieve a reconciliation of the rival positions, especially in cities, will have to take into account the climate emergency and the possibility of water stress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Shansha, for expounding on that broader global political and even philosophical context that also affects our local value situation. So we now move on to our question and answer forum, and I invite the audience to think of their questions and send them now in our Zoom chat box or in our comment section over on our YouTube live stream. Our panelists are present in the Zoom meeting to answer your questions. So while you are thinking of your questions and while they're coming in, may I just summarize what our discussion has covered so far? So as a whole, our panel today has provided a comprehensive presentation on political and socio-economic dimensions of water use and service provision, particularly in the local case of Baguio City. So this is very relevant to the theme of our conference, which is the SDGs, so particularly SDG 6, clean water and sanitation. So Prof. Cruz talked about what water demand looks like in the city, and we have here the reality of the necessity of multiple sources due to water scarcity and therefore different prices, levels of convenience, and quality. And therefore, segueing to Prof. Mendoza's presentation, that economic status matters and dictates how households access water. And these poor households are often constrained or even excluded by features of the current system of the Baguio Water District, such as pricing. And therefore, there are policy recommendations that she presented that could address these issues of equity and affordability. And Prof. Sciencia concluded the panel by sharing to us the broader context of the politics of water security, which is really power over resources, where water is simultaneously a scarce resource and also a human right in the context of a climate emergency. And we see this now in the local situation of Baguio City, as expounded by earlier presentations, where water scarcity and economic status do aggravate these conflicts over values that manifest in real experiences, these matters of sources, multiple sources, adequacy, and equity in water service provision. So these issues still remain and must be addressed by the government through adequate policy. If we assert that water is a human right, therefore, it must be provided as a public good. So that is the coverage of our discussion so far from our three presenters. We look forward to your questions from the audience. All right, so just to our first question, just to start off the discussion to our panelists, and perhaps jumping off on the discussion presented by Prof. Sciencia, related to the SDG theme, how do we reconcile or perhaps situate sustainability of water management with the economic dimensions, so the affordability and equity of water service provision, particularly in the case of Baguio City? So any of our presenters can answer that in matters of sustainability and affordability. And call in our panelists. Prof. Mendoza, Prof. Cruz, and Prof. Sciencia. Is there any input? Prof. Mendoza, I think nakamute po kayo.
All right. I don't know if Professor Ali wanted to answer that, but my first reaction is that the concept of sustainability is precisely one which forces us, if you might say, to put the balance correctly between economic use and consideration for environmental issues or concerns. So I think that today it is not possible to argue anymore purely for reasons of profitability or reasons only of economic survival. I think today you have to put all those values at the same level. And what that says to all of us, it is more difficult to do policy. I think that's really what it says. To pursue sustainable development means we have to think about our policy options better and balance this better. But you see, voices therefore should be allowed to be heard. I think that's from the political point of view, you have to allow the voices of different groups to surface, but we have to make those choices, meaning there is no way only one value ought to be pursued. Not anymore, and not today. That would be my comment on your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Mendoza. We'd like to recognize Prof. Bawanan. Ma'am Zenaida, you may unmute po and raise your question to the panelists.
Okay, thank you for the three presentations. I have comments and a question right at the same time. So I just noticed that the study was conducted in 2015 to 2016. So most probably, if we look at the land use change in Baguio City, it has already been significantly changed. Ang dami ng mga nag-rise na mga condominium. And so this might have some implication in terms of water resource in Baguio City. So I would assume that there are less water available for common households kasi nga there are already a lot of condominium, other establishments that have been in operation after 2016. So with that comment, my question is, have you submitted a copy of your research to the local government unit so that it can be used as in aid of legislation for the proper land use system here in Baguio City?
Okay. Hello.
Yeah, go ahead, Ali.
So the the 2015 study was submitted to IIED, which is an institute in the United Kingdom. We submitted the 2016 to ICLEI. It's a group of which is for local governments. I remember giving a copy of our studies, not exactly to local government, not here in Baguio. I gave a copy of our book to this Baguio movement for restoration, conservation, and also gave a copy to a person who works for a water company. I think they're into the bulk water system. Pero I don't remember giving a copy to local government unit. Hindi. Although I'm sure because we were also in contact with itong SEPMO. So may mga discussions with them on this matter. I don't know lang kung natanggap nila yung Yeah, pero I remember binigyan din kami ng ng mga materials nila So I think may mga nangyaring palitan ng documents. Baka nga nabigyan namin sila ng 2015 study. Hindi ko lang sigurado ngayon.
Baka maganda rin may follow up.
Yeah, after the pandemic.
Thank you.
May I respond to Professor Bawanan?
Yes, go ahead po, ma'am.
Okay, the question of Professor Bawanan is the effect of the condominium building that has been rapidly becoming visible to everybody. The study that we did in 2015 and 2016 is about trying to understand the household aspect of water demand. Because we normally read and hear about how Bawadi talks about its total supply. When he talks about how it provides for water in the city, it talks about its sources, what it has already added, its pipe, the expansion of its pipes, its water sources, its pumps, etc. So we wanted to balance that perspective by talking about the demand side, and specifically we're talking about the household side. We have not even dealt with the commercial demand. That's a different aspect of the demand. And the building of condominiums, again, this is just from the top of our heads, at least my head, is to say that the building of the condominiums either can be thought of as the tourist demand that will eventually, or that should be studied, which is again the demand from a commercial point of view rather than household. Unless you are saying that the condominium units are going to be the new residential units for people who will actually stay in Baguio City. And therefore, we are talking about household demand. And so we have to update our 2015-2016 study on that basis, because our 2015-2016 was based on barangay populations. Okay, so the other point is that we also know that in the construction, many of these condominiums look for their own water sources and will develop their water sources for their condominiums. In fact, I think that's part of the, the sales speech that they make to possible purchasers or buyers of their condominium units. That issue has been touched in one of the papers that we have already written on this, and that is the issue of who is watching over the total water sources of the city. Bawadi is using some of it for its own purposes, but what about all the other water sources when it is on private land? Because if it's on public land, then I think Bawadi might have first choice to use that. But if it's on private land, which is on condominium land, for example, owned by a private developer, then if the water source is found there and they will use it to develop their water source for their buyers, who questions that or who's going to ask about that? And so the question will be, but that will affect the so-called water table. And so we're getting into a bigger and bigger issue about who should be regulating those aspects. So I'm happy to just tell Professor Bawanan that raising that issue really can be, raising the issue of condominium development brings in many aspects that need to be studied in more depth on its effect on water demand and water supply in Baguio City.
Thank you, Prof. Mendoza. And Prof. Ali would also like to add that the study was also presented to Congressman Mark Go for further input. No? So, Ma'am Zenaida, any rejoinder po, naka-raise po kayo ng hand.
Yes, parang follow-up lang. So I'm just glad to know that there is already an initial study regarding the water resource here in Baguio City. So I'm glad that Professor Mendoza has pointed out that there is really a need to come up with a follow-up study looking into all of these issues, particularly the rising number of condominiums and other establishments here in the city. Thank you, Prof. Mendoza.
Okay. Thank you very much, professors. We have a question for the first presentation. So Prof. Gladys Cruz. Good morning, ma'am, and thank you. I find it interesting that your presentation highlighted a low perception or no perception of water inadequacy due to multiple sources, despite the reality of water scarcity. Does this mean that it isn't really a political demand or a policy priority of Baguio residents since they think that their water sources are more or less adequate?
Thank you. I think that the issue of water adequacy is still an issue, okay? Despite the fact that households are able to find additional sources aside from, for example, Bawadi water. Therefore, in that sense, regulating all kinds of water sources would be important. For example, ensuring that prices are affordable and that the quality of water is really potable and good for the health of people. These are things that should come to the fore, no, of public policy. So adequacy is not sufficient. That's just one aspect of the issue of ensuring that everybody has water, because at the end of the day, people have other uses of their time, for example. And so if your only water source is an undeveloped spring or creek that is far from your place of residence, that would still imply that it will still require some time, okay, on the part of households, for example, just to access their water. So in that sense, there is a need for government to continue addressing the issue of ensuring that everybody has water. Okay, so in that sense, the political economy of water is a very significant issue that must be addressed in public policy right now.
Thank you, ma'am. And adding on to that and going back also to what Prof. Mendoza mentioned about, the democratic participation of peoples and perhaps the question on the conflict of values raised by Prof. Ciencia. Just to tie everything together po, actually it's related to SDG 6, no, Target 8, which highlights local participation in water management. So how can we situate or characterize local people's participation initiatives in the political economy of water in Baguio City? How are the people of Baguio City participating in this system of provision?
Ako lang, so wait. I did not include this in my presentation, but so I did not discuss it really. But when you talk of politics, it's also about decision making. Um, so when we have this discussion, hindi ko na isama to pero all this discussion about finding other sources of water, like yung, the proposal to have a bulk water system, it may be a good idea, but I get the impression that there's very little local community participation. Hindi pinag-usapan And so now I attended many, siguro a number of where you have different companies presenting their proposals, but they cannot really present all of their proposals because may mga confidentiality issues, may mga business concerns. So this brings us to a point to ask a question: to what extent can the people really participate in deciding where to get their water? And the impression I get is that somehow pinasa na natin sa bawadi or siguro sa refilling stations yung decision where we will get our water. Nawawala na yung democratic aspect. Yun yung pinaka-impression ko. Hindi ko pa talaga napag-aralan ng maayos, pero that's the first impression I get. Wala yung local participation, napaka-limited.
Thank you for that, Prof. Ali. If the professors have no other rejoinders to that, we are actually out of time and we have no more questions in the chat box. So thank you very much to the panelists. Professors, we hope that the points raised by this discussion will contribute towards more equitable, affordable, and sustainable water provision as a public good and a human right here in Baguio City. So thank you as well to our participants here in the Zoom room and those on YouTube Live for contributing to this discussion.